Okay, I feel like I'm talking too much, probably because I am. But I just love this novel, and I think it's so beautiful and it's so masterfully done that I have a hard time kind of reining it in. But I'm going to try to rein it in a little bit and just hit on some highlights going forward. Okay, so in chapter 24, we have the escape, the day of the escape, the plan and the day. I'm not going to go over all of that because it's really self-explanatory. Paul D tells us that everything that they had on Sweet Home depended on Garner being alive. And when Garner died, everything changed. I mean, their world changed because their world was defined first by Garner, who practiced a more humane version of slavery, but we've talked about the inhumanity was not the beatings, it was the ownership. And then their identity was later defined by school teacher, who was far less humane. So one of the things, though, that I want to highlight in this chapter is this exchange, and then it picks up again in a later chapter. I'm going to cover it all right here. This exchange between Paul D and Stampede. When Stampede comes to the church and finds Paul D there, he says, I was there, Paul D, when it happened. She wanted to out-hurt the herder. And he goes on, when it picks back up in a later chapter, he goes on to tell Paul D about his wife, Vashti. Again, we have naming as important here. One time I was in church and we were reading something from the book of Esther, and it talked about Vashti. I was like, wait a minute. It was the wife of King Xerxes. I was like, that's the name of Stampede's wife. And because I know that names are important to Morrison, I thought, okay, there's something to unpack here. And there is. In the book of Esther, King Xerxes calls his wife Vashti. He has a big drunken party, 2 weeks. All of his friends are there. They're all drinking. And he calls his wife Vashti to present herself in her crown to be appreciated by his guests. And that was a dishonor. It would have been a dishonor in their culture for her to present herself to a room full of drunken men. So she refused. And King Xerxes, in his anger, divorced her for disobeying his orders and sent out a royal decree throughout the land, all of the lands that he ruled, that said men would have authority in their own households. Okay, so here we have Stampede, who can understand Setha because he wanted to be able to protect his wife from the sexual abuse that she was experiencing. She has to present herself in a cameo, a black ribbon with a cameo. So we have that connection of presenting yourself ornamented in some way, in an ornament that identifies the woman as property of their husbands or the property of a man, who calls them to him and they don't have any freedom to resist. And Stamp wants to protect her and he can't. And so that thing that King Xerxes offered to his people, that men should have authority in their household, that is precisely the thing that Stampede is not entitled to. He cannot have authority in his own household, and he can not protect his wife. And he says, when he's telling Paul D this, he said one day he was looking at her and he thought he would snap her neck. He said she had a tiny little neck. I could just snap it like a twig. And Paul D said, did you do it? And he said, no, I changed my name. Paul D said, what happened to her? And he said, she died. So Stampede can understand Setha's desire to kill in order to save from suffering, but he doesn't do it. But he understands what motivates her to do it. but he doesn't. Um, and we see, he says in that, and this always kind of bothered me, he said that when she would, it was at the period of a year that she would sometimes be called to spend the night with the master's son. And he said, I barely touched her and I hardly said 3 words to her, which seems very cruel, but it speaks to the rage, the impotence, the inability to protect her as his wife. That there was no place for that rage to go, because he thought about killing the young master, and Vashti said, no, because if you do, you'll kill yourself, and I won't have anyone to return to when he's finished with me. So Stamp Paid stays alive for her, and is forced to deal with that emasculation that comes from not having any authority to protect his own family. So I think that's really important. Okay, so, and that's why Stamp Paid can understand what motivated Setha. Now, he didn't do the same thing. I don't think he condones what she did. But he had the feeling at one point, right? Okay, book 3 starts 124 was quiet, and we see this this shift. We have kind of originally this harmony. Setha and Beloved, Setha quits her job, she stays home, they're all wrapped up in each other. They're wearing carnival clothes. I mean, bright colors. Color's really important in this novel. She can see color again. And then that's essentially what Seth is saying, that she can see, now that she has Beloved back, she can see color again, and she just wants to drape herself in color. The world is bright and vibrant, and it hasn't been before this. But it all goes south because, like I said, Beloved is not a friendly ghost. And it goes from this harmony to spite. And the more Beloved becomes spiteful, the more Setha tries to keep her happy and tries to explain why she did what she did. And the more she explains, the more spiteful Beloved comes, and Denver's on the margins. Denver is outside of this. And she begins to, originally she thought she had to protect Beloved from Setha. Now she realizes she has to protect Setha from Beloved. And it reaches a point where they don't have any food. Setha and Beloved are just basically at each other's throats, and Denver realizes that she has to be the one that gets them help. And so for the first time in her life, she steps off the porch. She leaves 124. She spent her life mostly in that house. She doesn't have any community connections. She finally decides that she's got to leave the porch, and she goes into the community. And that community that had abandoned Baby Suggs after the party, that community rallies. Okay, this is really important for Denver, because Denver, we talked about how Denver doesn't have a history. She doesn't know any of her family's past, and that was very isolating. She also has not had a community, and that's been very isolating. So this act of stepping off the porch reconnects Denver with something larger than herself, and that gives her a sense of identity. I mean, Denver flowers. Denver, it represents that first generation born out of slavery, and she has potential. By the end of the novel, Denver has potential. She has a future, she has friends, and it's all because she made peace with her past, and she connected to something larger than herself, a community. And so that reaching back out to the community is really important for Denver. So she's the one that has to go and get help. And people in the community start leaving food. Anyway, I want to go to the end. Denver gets a job, with the Bodwins, the white family that were abolitionists. And Mr. Bodwin is coming to pick her up for her first day of work. And we see The women from the community, they have come to figure out what's going on here. Is this a ghost? And if this is a ghost, we got to deal with it, because we can't have these ghosts coming back and tormenting us from beyond the grave. And this is not the way it's supposed to be. So we've got the women, we've got Mr. Bodwin coming, and we have Setha and Beloved on the porch. It talks about Beloved's big belly. Now, Morrison has said that Beloved is pregnant with Paul D's baby. I don't like that reading, and I don't read it that way. The way that I read it is Beloved is getting bigger, Setha is getting smaller. Setha has gotten very, very skinny. I always read that as sort of metaphorically that Beloved is consuming Setha. So she's consuming her spirit, her will, and that is manifested in sort of, because Beloved's a ghost, she's supernatural, sort of manifested in sort of a physical consumption of her, right? As Setha gets smaller, Beloved gets bigger. But the really important thing in this moment is Setha sees Mr. Bodwin's hat, and it reminds her of school teacher when she saw school teacher's hat. And she's pretty addled at this point. And what does she do? She has an ice pick in her hand. When she saw school teacher's hat, she killed her children. When she sees Mr. Bodwin's hat, when she has the opportunity to reenact what she had done before, she goes after Mr. Bodwin. She goes after the white man. She thinks it's school teacher in her kind of adult state. When she has the chance to do it again, she doesn't do it again. When she has the chance to kill her children again, all this time she's tried to explain why she did it and justify it. But when she has the opportunity to do it again, she makes a different choice. She told us in the first chapter when she talked to Paul D, I took one trip and I paid for the ticket and it cost too much. So all of this rationalizing, this is why I've done it, it's just rationalizing. Because she wouldn't do it again. She doesn't try to kill her children when she thinks they're threatened the next time. She tries to kill the person that she thinks is the threat. That's really important. And we don't know what happens to Beloved. She disappears. Okay, we have just a little bit more. I'm going to put it in a separate video. This second to the last chapter is my favorite chapter. I think it's a really beautiful chapter. I think this is Paul D and Setha is one of the great literary love stories. There's so much kindness in this chapter. So I'm going to put that on a separate video.